Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the shadowy corners of medieval survival, those forgotten techniques that kept our ancestors alive through plagues, famines, and the occasional Viking raid. You're probably lying there in your climate-controlled room, thinking you're pretty tough because you survived a day without Wi-Fi. But let me tell you something. If you were dropped into medieval Europe tomorrow, you'd probably last about as long as a chocolate teapot in a blacksmith's forge. Picture this. It's 1347, and you're standing in a bustling medieval marketplace. The air is thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, rotting vegetables, and something that might be either bread or last week's horse feed. Honestly, the line was pretty blurry back then. The cobblestones beneath your feet are slick with, well, let's just say medieval cities weren't exactly known for their sanitation standards. You hear the clatter of wooden wheels, the bleating of goats, and somewhere in the distance, a town crier shouting about the latest royal decree. But here's the thing that would probably shock you most. Despite living in what we'd consider absolutely horrific conditions, these people had survival skills that would make Bear Grylls weep with envy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing how this little corner of YouTube connects people from all over the world, whether you're in downtown Los Angeles at midnight or somewhere in rural Australia watching the sunrise. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval world wasn't just about knights in shining armor and damsels in distress. Though trust me, there were plenty of both. It was a time when knowing how to extract drinking water from morning dew could mean the difference between life and death. When understanding which mushrooms would feed your family and which would send them to meet their maker was literally survival 101. These weren't primitive people stumbling around in the dark. They were incredibly resourceful humans who had to be creative just to see another sunrise. Let's start with something that might surprise you. Medieval people were absolute masters of food preservation. I'm not talking about your grandmother's pickle recipes here. I'm talking about techniques so advanced that we're only now rediscovering some of them. Take smoking, for instance. You probably think you know about smoking meat because you've seen it done at your local barbecue joint. But medieval smoking was an art form that would make modern pitmasters look like amateurs. They didn't just throw meat over a fire and hope for the best. Medieval smokers understood the science behind different wood types in ways that seem almost mystical today. Oak for beef, apple for pork, and beech for fish. Each wood contained specific chemical compounds that not only preserved the meat, but created flavor profiles that could last for months. The process involved building elaborate smoking houses with precisely calculated airflow systems, temperature controls that relied on the position of stones and the direction of prevailing winds, and timing that was measured not in hours, but in phases of the moon. But here's where it gets really interesting. They also used what we now know as controlled fermentation to create what they called hung beef. This wasn't just jerky. This was meat that was aged in specific conditions that allowed beneficial bacteria to colonize the surface, creating a natural protective barrier against harmful pathogens. Modern food scientists are just now beginning to understand how these medieval techniques actually worked at a microbial level. And spoiler alert, they were brilliant. Historians still argue whether these preservation methods were developed through trial and error, or if there was some deeper understanding of the biological processes involved. But what we do know is that a properly prepared piece of medieval hung beef could remain edible for over a year without refrigeration. Try doing that with your store-bought lunch meat. Now, let's talk about water. Because if you think finding clean drinking water is hard now, imagine trying to do it when the local river doubles as the town's sewage system, garbage disposal, and tanning facility all rolled into one. Medieval people developed an array of water purification techniques that would make modern survivalists jealous. They knew, for instance, that running water through charcoal made from specific types of wood could remove not just the obvious dirt and debris, but also the mysterious bad humors that seemed to make people sick, what we now know as bacteria and other pathogens. But here's the really clever part. They also discovered that certain clay pots, when filled with questionable water and buried in specific types of soil for predetermined periods, would somehow produce clean drinking water. This technique, called earth filtering, actually works because certain clay minerals naturally bind with harmful bacteria and heavy metals, effectively creating a primitive but highly effective water treatment system. They even figured out how to harvest clean water from the air itself. During the cooler months, medieval survivors would set up elaborate dew collection systems using specially woven cloth that could capture moisture from the morning air and funnel it into storage containers. A well-designed dew collector could produce several gallons of clean water overnight, enough to keep a small family hydrated even during the driest periods. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval survival was their relationship with plants. These people didn't have WebMD to diagnose their symptoms, but they had something arguably more valuable: an intimate knowledge of every plant, herb, and fungus within a day's walk of their homes. They knew which leaves could stop bleeding, which roots could reduce fever, and which berries could provide essential vitamins during the long winter months when fresh food was just a distant memory. Take willow bark, for instance. Medieval healers knew that chewing on the inner bark of willow trees could reduce pain and inflammation, though they had no idea they were essentially taking a primitive form of aspirin. The active compound in willow bark, salicin, is chemically very similar to the active ingredient in modern aspirin tablets. Pretty impressive for people who supposedly didn't understand science, right? But perhaps the most remarkable thing about medieval survival techniques was how they were passed down through generations. This wasn't written knowledge. Most people couldn't read anyway. This was oral tradition that had to be perfect, because someone's life might depend on remembering exactly how many finger widths deep to plant seeds, or precisely which phase of the moon was best for harvesting medicinal herbs. These survival skills weren't just practical knowledge. They were the foundation of an entire worldview that emphasized preparation, community cooperation, and respect for the natural world. In a time when a failed harvest could doom an entire village, being able to find alternative food sources, purify water, and treat illnesses with local plants wasn't just useful. It was the difference between thriving and becoming another tragic footnote in history's long list of civilizations that didn't quite make it. As you drift off tonight, think about this. Those medieval ancestors of ours weren't just surviving. They were innovating, adapting, and passing on knowledge that kept human civilization alive through some of the darkest periods in our history. And they did it all without Google, Amazon Prime, or even a decent flashlight. That shepherd wasn't just anyone, though. Royal blood flowed through his veins, and Troy was waiting to welcome home its lost son. You see, there's something deliciously ironic about divine fate. The very person chosen to judge this cosmic beauty contest was actually Prince Paris of Troy, though he had absolutely no idea who he really was. Years earlier, Queen Hecuba of Troy had experienced one of those prophetic dreams that ancient royalty seemed to specialize in, the kind that make you wake up in a cold sweat and immediately call for the court soothsayers. In her nightmare, she gave birth to a flaming torch that consumed the entire city of Troy, reducing its magnificent walls to ash and its people to shadows. The terrified King Priam, faced with choosing between his unborn child and his kingdom, made the kind of heartbreaking decision that would haunt any parent. He ordered the infant to be abandoned on Mount Ida to die. But fate, as we've already established, has a twisted sense of humor. A kindly shepherd found the baby crying among the rocks and raised him as his own son, never suspecting he was nurturing the future destroyer of civilizations. So there's Paris, living his best shepherd life, thinking his biggest responsibility is making sure the sheep don't wander off a cliff, when suddenly he's thrust into the center of divine politics that would make modern international relations look like a children's tea party. Standing before him on the mountainside are three of the most powerful beings in existence, each ready to offer him bribes that would make a corrupt politician weep with envy. This isn't just a beauty contest. This is a cosmic auction where the prize is reshaping human destiny. Hera steps forward first, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. When the Queen of the Gods speaks, even the mountain itself seems to listen. "Choose me, young Paris," she declares, her words resonating with power that makes your bones vibrate. "And I will make you a king among kings. You shall rule not just a city, but an empire that spans the known world. Power will flow through your veins like divine ichor, and all mortals will bow before your throne." Now that's what you call a compelling offer. Imagine going from sheepherder to emperor in one divine transaction. Hera's promising the kind of political power that ancient rulers would literally sacrifice their children for. Which, spoiler alert, someone definitely will before this story ends. But Athena isn't about to let Hera steal the show. The goddess of wisdom and warfare steps forward, her gray eyes flashing with the kind of intelligence that can see 17 moves ahead in any cosmic chess game. "Power without wisdom is meaningless, Paris," she counters, her voice sharp as a perfectly forged spear point. "Choose me, and I will give you something far more valuable: wisdom beyond measure and victory in every battle you fight. Your strategies will be spoken of for millennia. Your tactical brilliance will make you immortal in the minds of warriors yet unborn." Historians still argue whether Athena's offer included actual military invincibility or just really, really good strategic thinking. But either way, it's the kind of gift that turns ordinary men into legends. Military genius, tactical supremacy, the ability to outthink any opponent. These are the tools that built empires and toppled kingdoms throughout history. But then Aphrodite glides forward, and suddenly the entire game changes. When the goddess of love speaks, roses literally bloom from the rocky soil at her feet, and the mountain air becomes perfumed with jasmine and desire. Her voice is like honey mixed with silk, warm sunlight on skin, and every romantic fantasy you've ever had rolled into one divine whisper. "My dear sweet Paris," she purrs, her words caressing the mountain breeze. "What use is power if your bed remains cold and empty? What good is tactical brilliance if you have no one to share your victories with? Choose me, and I will give you the greatest treasure any man could desire, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Helen of Sparta will be yours, and no man who looks upon her will not envy you." And there it is, the offer that seals the fate of two civilizations. Not political power, not military genius, but love. Or at least, the promise of love wrapped up in a package so beautiful it could launch 1,000 ships. Paris, young, and probably thinking with something other than his brain, barely hesitates before handing that golden apple to Aphrodite. The moment the fruit touches her divine fingers, you can feel the cosmic gears shifting into a new configuration. The wind changes direction on Mount Ida, carrying with it the scent of distant battles and burning cities. Hera's face transforms from regal disappointment into something far more terrifying: the cold, calculating fury of a goddess who has just been publicly humiliated by a mortal shepherd boy. She doesn't scream or throw divine tantrums. That would be beneath her royal dignity. Instead, her anger crystallizes into something pure and terrible, the kind of rage that doesn't just seek revenge but complete and utter destruction. The Queen of the Gods has been spurned, and that's the sort of insult that doesn't fade with time. It festers, grows, and eventually explodes into the kind of vengeance that reshapes the ancient world. Athena's reaction is equally ominous, but characteristically more controlled. Her gray eyes narrow with the kind of strategic thinking that's already calculating 17 different ways to make Paris regret his choice. When the goddess of wisdom decides to destroy you, she doesn't just ruin your life. She dismantles it piece by piece with surgical precision, turning your greatest strengths into your most devastating weaknesses. As the two rejected goddesses vanish in flashes of divine light that leave after images burned into your retinas, Paris probably thinks he's just won the cosmic lottery. After all, he's been promised the most beautiful woman in the world. What could possibly go wrong? He doesn't yet understand that divine gifts always come with divine prices, and that getting exactly what you wished for is often the most dangerous thing that can happen to a mortal. The shepherd prince stands alone on Mount Ida as the sun sets behind the peaks, clutching that golden apple and dreaming of the beautiful Helen he's never seen. He has no idea that his choice has just set in motion events that will consume the next decade of human history and give us the greatest war story ever told. Not long after this cosmic beauty pageant, Paris's true identity was discovered in one of those dramatic reveals that would make modern soap opera writers weep with envy. You're watching as Shepherd Boy transforms into Prince of Troy virtually overnight. Talk about your ultimate glow-up. Word reached King Priam that his long-lost son was alive and well, living the simple life on Mount Ida, completely oblivious to his royal heritage. The reunion scene in Troy's magnificent palace was everything you'd expect from ancient royal drama. Picture Priam, now an elderly king, with the weight of decades on his shoulders, embracing the son he thought was dead. The palace gleams with bronze and gold, tapestries depicting the glorious history of Troy hanging from massive stone walls that seem to stretch toward the heavens themselves. The air is thick with incense and the nervous energy of courtiers who aren't quite sure how to react to this miraculous return. Paris himself must have felt like he was living in some kind of fever dream. One day he's counting sheep, the next he's heir to one of the richest cities in the ancient world. Troy wasn't just any city, it was the city, controlling the vital trade routes between Europe and Asia. Its massive walls, built by the gods themselves, according to local legend. The wealth flowing through its gates made other kingdoms look like penny ante operations. But not everyone was thrilled about the prodigal prince's return. Enter Cassandra, Paris's sister, who possessed the gift or curse, depending on your perspective, of prophecy. Apollo had granted her the ability to see the future in exchange for, well, let's just say divine romantic favors. But when Cassandra changed her mind about the arrangement, the offended god twisted his gift into a curse. She could see the future perfectly, but no one would ever believe her predictions. So there's Cassandra, watching her brother's triumphant return, and suddenly she's hit with visions that would make a horror movie director jealous. She sees fire. Endless, consuming flames licking at Troy's towers. She sees blood running in the streets, mighty walls crumbling, and the proud city reduced to smoking ruins. And at the center of it all is Paris, her newly returned brother, standing like the eye of a hurricane of destruction. "Fire!" she screams, her voice echoing through the palace halls with the kind of desperate urgency that makes everyone's blood run cold. "I see fire consuming our walls. Paris will bring destruction. Send him back to the mountains before it's too late." But here's the cruel irony of her curse. Her words ring with absolute truth, yet everyone dismisses them as the ravings of a madwoman. Historians still argue whether Cassandra's prophecies were genuine divine revelation or just really good intuition combined with impressive dramatic flair. But what's undeniable is that every single one of her predictions would come true with terrifying accuracy. Yet in that moment, surrounded by the joy of Paris's return, her warnings fall on deaf ears. Hector, the eldest prince and Troy's greatest warrior, had more practical concerns about his brother's return. Picture him, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from being undefeated in battle and genuinely beloved by his people. While others celebrated, Hector pulled Paris aside for one of those brotherly conversations that can make or break kingdoms. "Brother," Hector said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who actually understood the responsibilities of royal blood. "Do you have any idea what you've gotten yourself into? This isn't shepherd life where your biggest worry is wolves stealing sheep. You're a prince of Troy now. Your actions affect thousands of people." But Paris, intoxicated by his newfound status and probably still high from his divine encounter with Aphrodite, brushed off his brother's concerns with the casual arrogance of someone who's never faced real consequences. He had royal blood, divine favor, and the promise of the most beautiful woman in the world. What could possibly go wrong? King Priam, meanwhile, was dealing with the complex emotions of any parent who gets a second chance with a child they thought they'd lost forever. The old king showered Paris with gifts, titles, and responsibilities, trying to make up for decades of lost time. And when Paris announced he wanted to lead a diplomatic mission to the Greek kingdoms, ostensibly to strengthen trade relationships and political alliances, Priam eagerly agreed. What the aging king didn't realize was that Paris had a very specific destination in mind: Sparta, where the legendary Helen lived as queen to King Menelaus. Aphrodite's promise was burning in his mind like a divine obsession, and diplomatic immunity seemed like the perfect cover for what he was really planning. The preparations for Paris's journey were elaborate affairs worthy of a royal expedition. Ships were loaded with treasures from across the known world, silks from distant lands, precious metals that gleamed like captured sunlight, exotic spices that could make a man wealthy just from their aroma. The diplomatic gifts were calculated to impress even the richest Greek kings, demonstrating Troy's wealth and power while providing Paris with the perfect excuse to visit foreign courts. As you watch the Trojan ships preparing to depart, their black hulls cutting through the wine-dark waters of the Aegean, you can almost feel destiny holding its breath. The wind that fills their sails carries more than just ships toward Greece. It's carrying the seeds of the greatest war in ancient history, planted by a golden apple and nurtured by divine spite. Paris stands at the bow of the lead ship, his royal robes fluttering in the sea breeze, probably thinking he's embarking on the greatest adventure of his life. Behind him, Troy's walls rise majestically from the coastline, looking eternal and unshakable in the morning light. He has no idea that this journey will set in motion events that will bring those mighty walls crashing down and turn his name into a byword for the kind of selfish desire that destroys civilizations. The ships disappear over the horizon, carrying their precious cargo and their dangerous prince toward a collision with fate that will echo through the ages. In Troy, Cassandra continues her unheeded warnings, while Hector prepares for responsibilities he doesn't yet know are coming. And somewhere in the distance, the winds that carry Paris toward his destiny also carry the first whispers of approaching war. When Helen entered a room, conversations didn't just pause, they died completely, as if the very air had been suddenly sucked out of the space. You're witnessing something that transcends ordinary human beauty. Something that makes strong men forget their own names and wise men abandon decades of careful planning. This is the face that will launch 1,000 ships, and right now she's living quietly in Sparta, completely unaware that her beauty has just become the most dangerous weapon in the ancient world. Picture Sparta in 1190 BCE, not the austere military state it would later become, but a prosperous kingdom ruled by Menelaus, one of the most powerful kings in Greece. The palace gleams with bronze and gold, its walls decorated with the spoils of successful military campaigns and profitable trade expeditions. This is wealth and power made manifest in stone and metal, but none of it matters when Helen walks through those halls. Helen herself is the stuff of legends, literally. According to the stories, she's the daughter of Zeus himself, born from his liaison with Leda, in one of those typically complicated divine romantic encounters that populate Greek mythology. Whether you believe the divine parentage or not, there's no denying that Helen possesses the kind of beauty that seems almost supernatural, the sort that makes people question everything they thought they knew about desire and longing. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Helen's beauty had already caused one international incident before Paris ever showed up. As a young woman, she'd been so famously beautiful that suitors came from every corner of Greece, each one hoping to win her hand and, more importantly, the political alliance that marriage would bring. We're talking about the greatest heroes of the age, kings, princes, and warriors whose names were already becoming legend. Her father, King Tyndareus, found himself in an impossible position. Choose one suitor, and you automatically make enemies of all the others. The kind of enemies who have armies, fleets, and very long memories. It was a diplomatic nightmare that could have sparked wars across the Greek world, until clever Odysseus proposed a solution that seemed brilliant at the time, but would prove catastrophic later. Odysseus suggested that all the suitors swear a sacred oath. They would accept Helen's choice of husband, and, more crucially, they would all band together to defend her marriage against anyone who might threaten it. It was like a mutual defense pact, wrapped around a wedding vow, guaranteed by the gods themselves, and witnessed by the greatest heroes of the age. Historians still argue whether this oath was Odysseus's genuine attempt at diplomacy or if he was playing some deeper game. But what's certain is that every major Greek leader signed on to it. Agamemnon, Achilles, Ajax, Diomedes, they all swore to protect Helen's marriage, probably thinking it was just ceremonial nonsense that would never actually matter. Helen chose Menelaus, and for several years everything seemed perfect. The marriage was strong, Sparta prospered, and the oath that bound Greece's heroes seemed like ancient history. Menelaus was genuinely devoted to his wife, while Helen appeared content with her role as queen of one of Greece's most powerful kingdoms. They even had a daughter together, little Hermione, who seemed to promise a stable dynasty for generations to come. But then Paris arrived with his diplomatic mission, and suddenly everything changed. Picture the Trojan prince in his prime, handsome in that exotic Eastern way that would seem thrillingly foreign to Greek eyes, wealthy beyond imagination, and carrying gifts that demonstrated Troy's incredible prosperity. He had silks that shimmered like captured moonlight, jewelry that made royal treasures look like children's toys, and most dangerous of all, he had charm. Paris wasn't just another diplomatic visitor. He was a prince who knew how to make women feel like goddesses. He brought Helen gifts that weren't just valuable but personal, chosen specifically for her tastes and interests. He told her stories of distant lands and exotic cultures, painted pictures of Troy's magnificence that made even prosperous Sparta seem provincial by comparison. And here's where Aphrodite's divine influence might have been working its magic. Whether Helen fell in love naturally or was influenced by divine intervention, she began spending more and more time with the charming Trojan prince. Their conversations grew longer, their glances more meaningful, and the very air between them seemed to crackle with the kind of romantic tension that makes everyone else in the room uncomfortable. Menelaus, unfortunately, was called away at the worst possible moment. His grandfather had died, and royal protocol demanded that he attend the funeral rites personally. It was one of those non-negotiable obligations that ancient kings couldn't ignore without risking their political standing. So he kissed his wife goodbye, welcomed Paris to enjoy Spartan hospitality in his absence, and set off for what should have been a routine family obligation. Left alone with Helen. Well, as alone as royalty ever gets with dozens of servants and guards around, Paris made his move. This wasn't some crude attempt at seduction, but rather a carefully orchestrated romantic campaign that would make modern pickup artists weep with admiration. He had divine backing, unlimited resources, and most importantly, he had Aphrodite's promise burning in his heart like a sacred flame. What happened next is one of history's great mysteries. Did Helen genuinely fall in love with Paris and choose to abandon her marriage for passion? Was she enchanted by Aphrodite's divine magic, making her choices not entirely her own? Or was she simply kidnapped by a charming prince who was skilled at making abduction look like romance? The ancient sources disagree, and honestly, the truth probably lies somewhere in that murky territory where desire, divine intervention, and political opportunism all meet. What we know for certain is that when Menelaus returned from his grandfather's funeral, he found his palace strangely quiet, his wife gone, and a significant portion of his royal treasury missing along with her. Paris and Helen had vanished in the night, taking ship for Troy along with enough gold and silver to finance a small army. The wind that carried their ship across the wine-dark Aegean wasn't just moving two lovers toward their destiny. It was carrying the spark that would ignite the greatest war in ancient history, all because a golden apple had started a divine beauty contest, and a shepherd prince had chosen love over wisdom. The sound of war horns echoed across Greece like thunder rolling between mountains, and suddenly that old oath that seemed so ceremonial was becoming a matter of life and death. You're witnessing the moment when Helen's abduction, or elopement, depending on your perspective, transforms from royal scandal into international crisis. Those wedding vows sworn years ago are about to be paid in blood, bronze, and the lives of heroes. When Menelaus returned to find his wife and treasure gone, his rage shook the very foundations of his palace. This wasn't just personal betrayal, though that certainly stung, but a massive insult to Greek honor that couldn't go unanswered. In the ancient world, taking another man's wife was essentially declaring war on his entire civilization, and Paris had just slapped the face of Greece itself. Menelaus immediately sent messengers galloping across the Greek kingdoms, carrying news of the outrage and calling in that sacred oath. The message was simple but devastating. Helen has been stolen, Greek hospitality has been violated, and every hero who swore to protect her marriage must now honor their word or be forever branded as oath breakers. Enter Agamemnon, Menelaus's older brother and the most powerful king in Greece. Picture him in his palace at Mycenae, the city Homer called rich in gold, surrounded by the wealth and military might that made him the natural leader of any Greek coalition. Agamemnon was the kind of ruler who'd been waiting his entire life for an opportunity like this. A chance to unite the fractious Greek kingdoms under his command and expand his influence across the known world. But here's the thing about calling up ancient heroes. Some of them were less than enthusiastic about honoring their old promises. Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, took one look at the situation and immediately tried to weasel out of his obligation in a way that would make modern politicians proud. When Agamemnon's recruiters arrived at his island kingdom, they found Odysseus behaving like a complete madman. Picture this scene. There's Odysseus, supposedly one of the wisest men in Greece, yoking an ox and a horse together to plow his fields while sowing salt instead of seeds. He's babbling nonsense, drooling on himself, and generally acting like someone who's completely lost his marbles. It was actually a pretty clever ploy. Ancient armies didn't draft crazy people, so madness seemed like the perfect excuse to avoid what was shaping up to be a very dangerous war. But Palamedes, one of Agamemnon's craftier allies, wasn't buying the insanity act for a second. In a move that would make psychological warfare experts applaud, he placed Odysseus's infant son Telemachus directly in the path of the crazy king's plow. Suddenly faced with the choice between maintaining his charade and killing his own child, Odysseus swerved to avoid his son, proving beyond doubt that he was perfectly sane and just trying to avoid military service. Historians still argue whether Odysseus's madness was a genuine attempt to avoid war or just really elaborate performance art. But either way, he found himself bound by oath and honor to join Agamemnon's expedition. And once the cleverest king in Greece was committed, it became much harder for other heroes to find excuses. The real prize, though, was Achilles. The young warrior prophesied to be either the greatest hero of his generation or completely invincible, depending on which oracle you asked. Finding Achilles proved trickier than anyone expected, because his mother Thetis, yes, the same sea nymph whose wedding started this whole mess, had hidden him on the island of Skyros, disguised as a girl among the daughters of the local king. Thetis knew something the rest of the world didn't. There was a prophecy about her son's fate. Achilles could choose a long, peaceful life in obscurity, or a short, glorious life that would make him immortal in human memory. She was desperately trying to keep him from making the choice that would lead to eternal fame and early death. But Odysseus, now committed to the war effort, whether he liked it or not, devised another brilliant scheme to flush out the hidden hero. Disguising himself as a traveling merchant, he arrived at Skyros with gifts supposedly intended for the king's daughters. Beautiful fabrics, jewelry, cosmetics, and other feminine treasures. But hidden among these gifts were a magnificent sword and shield that practically glowed with their own inner light. While the real princesses admired the pretty baubles, one girl made a beeline straight for the weapons. The moment those divine implements touched Achilles' hands, his disguise became meaningless. You can't hide a warrior's instincts, and Achilles was born to hold a sword like other people are born to breathe. So there's Achilles, caught red-handed with his true identity exposed, probably trying to explain why he was so interested in weaponry while wearing a dress. But here's the thing about legendary heroes. Once they're discovered, they tend to embrace their destiny with enthusiasm that borders on the terrifying. Achilles didn't just agree to join the expedition. He threw himself into it with the kind of passionate commitment that makes everyone around him slightly nervous. From across the Greek world, ships began converging on the harbor at Aulis like iron filings drawn to a massive magnet. King Idomeneus sailed from Crete with his bronze-armored warriors. Diomedes brought his contingent from Argos, and the two Ajaxes, Ajax the Greater from Salamis and Ajax the Lesser from Locris, arrived with their own fleets and followers. Nestor, the oldest and wisest of the kings, came from sandy Pylos with 90 ships and decades of military experience. The sight that greeted you at Aulis would have been absolutely breathtaking. Nearly 1,000 ships crowded the harbor, their black hulls creating a forest of masts and rigging that stretched as far as the eye could see. The beach was covered with tents, cooking fires, and roughly 100,000 of the finest warriors in the ancient world, all preparing for what promised to be the military expedition of a lifetime. But then disaster struck in the most frustrating way possible. The wind stopped blowing. Not a breeze, not a whisper, just dead calm that left the mighty fleet trapped in harbor like toys in a bathtub. Day after day passed with the ships sitting motionless, their sails hanging limp, while provisions dwindled and morale began to crack under the pressure of waiting for something, anything, to happen. The weeks stretched into months at Aulis, and what had started as an impressive military gathering was turning into a logistical nightmare that would make modern event planners break out in cold sweats. You're watching as nearly 100,000 warriors, the cream of Greek civilization, sit trapped by supernatural stillness, while their supplies dwindle and their patience evaporates like morning dew under a brutal sun. Agamemnon was facing the kind of leadership crisis that destroys careers and kingdoms. Here he was, supposedly the great unifier of Greece, commanding the largest military force in human history, and he couldn't even get his ships out of the harbor. The other kings were starting to mutter about returning home, the common soldiers were getting restless, and every day of delay weakened his authority just a little bit more. Desperate for answers, Agamemnon turned to Calchas, the expedition's chief seer, and the kind of prophet who specialized in delivering news that made kings wish they'd never asked the question in the first place. Picture Calchas, elderly, wise, with a sort of penetrating gaze that seemed to see straight through to your soul's darkest secrets. When he spoke, even the bravest warriors listened with the kind of attention usually reserved for approaching thunderstorms. The goddess Artemis holds back the winds, Calchas announced, his voice carrying across the camp with the weight of divine authority. She demands payment for an offense against her sacred deer, killed in her grove by the king's own hand. And here's where the situation went from bad to absolutely catastrophic, because the goddess wouldn't accept just any sacrifice. She wanted something that would tear Agamemnon's heart out, the life of his eldest daughter, Iphigenia. Now imagine you're Agamemnon trying to process this impossible demand. On one hand, you've got 100,000 warriors depending on your leadership, the honor of Greece at stake, and your brother's marriage to avenge. On the other hand, you're being asked to murder your own child to appease a goddess who's apparently holding the entire expedition hostage over some deer that you probably don't even remember killing. The king's initial reaction was exactly what you'd expect from any father: absolute, furious refusal. He raged against the prophecy, called Calchas a false prophet, and threatened to abandon the entire expedition rather than harm his beloved daughter. But as the days continued to pass with no change in the weather, and as the other kings grew more impatient, Agamemnon's resolve began to crack under the enormous pressure. Historians still argue whether Agamemnon's eventual decision represented genuine religious conviction or just cold political calculation. But what's certain is that he eventually caved to the demands of fate, duty, and divine will. He sent word to his wife Clytemnestra back in Mycenae, but here's where the story gets even more twisted. He didn't tell her the truth. Instead, Agamemnon crafted a lie that was almost more cruel than honesty would have been. He told Clytemnestra that Iphigenia was to be married to Achilles, the greatest hero of the expedition. Can you imagine the excitement in the palace when that message arrived? Their daughter was going to marry the most eligible warrior in Greece, cementing their family's place in history and ensuring the kind of alliance that kings dream about. So Clytemnestra prepared for what she thought would be the wedding of the century. She dressed Iphigenia in her finest robes, adorned her with jewelry that sparkled like captured starlight, and made the journey to Aulis with all the joy and anticipation of a mother seeing her daughter married to a hero. The irony was so sharp it could have cut bronze. When mother and daughter arrived at the military camp, the contrast between expectation and reality must have been devastating. Instead of wedding preparations, they found an army trapped by supernatural forces and a king whose eyes held the kind of desperate guilt that comes from making impossible choices. Iphigenia herself was radiant with excitement, probably chattering about her upcoming marriage to the legendary Achilles, completely unaware that she was walking toward an altar instead of a wedding bed. The moment of truth was as horrible as you'd expect. When Iphigenia finally learned what was really happening, her reaction was everything that makes this story so tragically compelling. Some accounts say she begged for her life with the desperate eloquence of someone too young to die. Others claim she accepted her fate with the kind of noble courage that would make grown warriors weep. A few versions suggest she willingly offered herself as sacrifice, understanding that the fate of Greece depended on appeasing Artemis's wrath. But here's what really happened when that bronze knife fell. The wind began to blow. Just like that, after weeks of supernatural stillness, the harbor filled with the sound of snapping sails and creaking rigging. The goddess had been appeased, the expedition could finally begin, and Greece's greatest military force was free to sail toward its destiny. Yet even as the ships prepared to depart, the seeds of future tragedy were already planted. Clytemnestra, devastated by her husband's betrayal and the loss of her daughter, made a vow that would echo through the years. She would have her revenge on Agamemnon, no matter how long it took or what price she had to pay. The king who sacrificed his child for military glory had just created his own future assassin. As the 1,000 ships finally moved out of Aulis harbor, their bronze-covered prows cutting through waves that sparkled like scattered jewels in the morning sun, you could feel destiny itself holding its breath. The wind that filled their sails carried more than just warriors toward Troy. It carried vengeance, tragedy, and the kind of epic story that would echo through human memory for thousands of years. Behind them, the altar where Iphigenia died was already being washed clean by gentle rain. But the blood spilled there had stained more than just stone. It had marked the beginning of a cycle of violence and retribution that would consume heroes, kings, and entire civilizations before it finally burned itself out in the ashes of Troy. 1,000 ships spreading across the wine-dark Aegean Sea created a sight that the ancient world had never witnessed and would probably never see again. You're watching the greatest armada in human history, cutting through crystalline waters, their bronze-fitted prows gleaming like captured sunlight, while 100,000 warriors sailed toward what they thought would be swift victory and glorious plunder. The journey from Aulis to Troy wasn't a direct voyage. These weren't modern cruise ships following GPS coordinates. The Greek fleet island hopped across the Aegean, stopping at scattered ports to take on fresh water, hunt for meat, and sometimes, well, let's just say not every island welcomed them as liberators. The expedition that had started as a noble quest to recover stolen Helen was already showing signs of the moral corruption that war brings to even the most heroic enterprises. Some islands submitted immediately, their rulers calculating that cooperation was healthier than resistance when faced with 100,000 armed Greeks who'd been cooped up on ships for days. These wise local kings offered tribute, supplies, and sometimes even additional warriors to join the expedition. But other islands, either from loyalty to Troy or just plain stubbornness, chose to resist. And that's where Achilles first began building his terrifying reputation. Picture Achilles in his first real battle, young, impossibly fast, and blessed with divine armor that seemed to turn aside enemy weapons like they were made of paper. When the fleet attacked Tenedos, a strategic island near the Trojan coast, local forces tried to ambush the Greeks as they came ashore seeking fresh water. Big mistake. Achilles led a counterattack that was less like military tactics and more like watching a natural disaster with a sword. The young hero moved through enemy ranks like death incarnate, his spear never missing its target, his shield deflecting attacks that should have been fatal. Warriors who had spent decades perfecting their combat skills found themselves facing someone who fought like the gods themselves had trained him, which, considering his divine mother Thetis, might not have been far from the truth. It was during these island raids that Achilles captured Briseis, a noble woman who would later become the cause of the greatest crisis in Greek military history. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, she was just another prize of war, beautiful and tragic in the way that war makes everyone and everything tragic eventually. Meanwhile, the expedition suffered its first major loss in a way that perfectly demonstrates how ancient warfare mixed heroism with sheer stupidity. Philoctetes, the master archer who carried the legendary bow of Heracles, was bitten by a venomous serpent on the sacred island of Lemnos. The wound festered, producing a stench so foul that even hardened warriors couldn't stand to be near him. Following Odysseus's coldly practical advice, Agamemnon made the kind of decision that would haunt the expedition later. They abandoned Philoctetes on Lemnos with his bow, leaving him to survive alone on a desolate island. It seemed like military efficiency at the time, but prophecy has a way of making cruel decisions come back to bite you, and they'd eventually need that divine bow to win the war. Historians still argue whether abandoning Philoctetes was pure military pragmatism or if there were deeper political motivations involved. But what's certain is that the Greeks had just marooned one of their most valuable warriors based on nothing more than the fact that his wound smelled bad. Ancient military medicine clearly had some room for improvement. As the fleet neared Trojan waters, the mood among the warriors shifted from adventure-seeking excitement to something more focused and dangerous. These men had spent months at sea, island hopping and raiding, gradually transforming from the civilized heroes who had gathered at Aulis into something harder and more ruthless. War was already changing them, stripping away the comfortable assumptions of peacetime and revealing the brutal realities underneath. The first glimpse of Troy from the sea must have been absolutely breathtaking. Rising from the coastal plains like something from a divine architect's dreams, the city's massive walls caught the morning light and threw it back in brilliant reflections. These weren't just fortifications, they were statements of power, wealth, and divine protection that seemed to challenge the very concept of human conquest. Troy's walls stood roughly 20 feet high and 12 feet thick, built from massive limestone blocks fitted together so perfectly that you couldn't slide a knife blade between them. According to local legend, they'd been constructed by Poseidon and Apollo themselves during a period when the gods owed service to a Trojan king. And looking at those impossible walls, you could almost believe the divine construction story. But impressive walls were just the beginning of Troy's defenses. The city controlled the Dardanelles, the narrow strait that connected the Aegean Sea to the rich trading routes of the Black Sea. Every merchant ship that wanted to pass through had to pay tribute to Troy, making it one of the wealthiest cities in the ancient world. The Greeks weren't just attacking a city, they were challenging an economic empire that had dominated regional trade for centuries. As the Greek ships approached the Trojan coastline, you could see the defenders preparing for what everyone assumed would be a quick siege followed by negotiation or surrender. After all, no city, no matter how well fortified, could withstand the combined might of every major Greek kingdom. The Trojans would surely see reason, return Helen and the stolen treasure, and everyone could go home with their honor intact. That optimistic assessment lasted exactly as long as it took for the first Greek warrior to set foot on Trojan soil. Protesilaus of Phylace, eager for the glory of being first ashore, leaped from his ship with sword raised and immediately took an arrow through the chest. An old prophecy had warned that the first Greek to touch Trojan land would be the first to die, and Protesilaus had just fulfilled that grim prediction with enthusiasm that exceeded his wisdom. His death sent shockwaves through both armies, not because one casualty was militarily significant, but because it signaled that this wasn't going to be the quick, negotiated settlement that everyone had been hoping for. The Trojans were prepared to fight for their city, the Greeks were committed to their mission of vengeance, And both sides were about to discover that some wars develop their own momentum that carries everyone involved far beyond their original intentions. As Greek forces established their beachhead and began building the fortified camp that would be their home for the next decade, the die was cast for what would become the most famous siege in human history. Neither side could know that they were beginning a conflict that would consume an entire generation of heroes and become the foundation story of Western literature. Those divine walls weren't just impressive, they were supposedly built by the hands of Poseidon and Apollo themselves, which meant that the Greeks were essentially trying to tear down a construction project supervised by gods. You're staring up at limestone blocks fitted so perfectly that even after centuries of weather and warfare, you still couldn't slide a dagger blade between the joints. These fortifications didn't just protect Troy, they made a statement about divine favor that could be seen from miles away. The city rising behind those impossible walls was everything legends claimed it to be. Troy controlled the vital Dardanelles Strait, that narrow waterway connecting the Aegean to the lucrative Black Sea trade routes. Every merchant vessel wanting passage had to pay tribute to Troy's coffers, making it one of the wealthiest cities in the ancient world. The Greeks weren't just besieging a city, they were challenging an economic empire that had grown fat on centuries of commercial dominance. Inside those mighty walls lived Prince Hector, Troy's greatest defender, and everything a hero should be. Picture him, tall, powerful, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from being genuinely beloved by your people and undefeated in single combat. Unlike his brother Paris, whose romantic adventures had started this whole mess, Hector embodied the noble warrior ideal. He was devoted to his wife Andromache, adored his infant son Astyanax, and carried the weight of Troy's survival on his shoulders with the kind of dignity that made even his enemies respect him. Andromache herself represented everything the war would ultimately destroy: domestic happiness, peaceful family life, and the simple joy of watching your child grow up in safety. When you saw her with little Astyanax, laughing as the baby reached for his father's bronze helmet, you were looking at innocence that had no idea how fragile it really was. The initial Greek landing was like watching unstoppable force meet immovable object. Wave after wave of bronze-armored warriors stormed the beaches, their war cries echoing off Troy's walls, while defenders rained arrows and spears down from the ramparts. The sand quickly turned red with blood from both sides, but those divine walls held firm against every assault the Greeks could mount. After the disaster of Protesilaus' death, remember, the first Greek to touch Trojan soil, who immediately fulfilled that grim prophecy, both sides settled in for what everyone still hoped would be a relatively brief siege. The Greeks established their camp along the beach, building earthworks and palisades that stretched for miles along the coastline. It was an impressive fortification in its own right, but nothing compared to Troy's god-built defenses. Then came the diplomatic mission that proved just how impossible this situation had become. Odysseus and Menelaus, representing the Greek coalition, approached Troy under a flag of truce to make one final attempt at peaceful resolution. Picture them walking through Troy's massive gates, past guards whose spear points followed their every move, into the great hall where King Priam held court, surrounded by the flower of Trojan nobility. The scene must have been tense enough to cut with a bronze sword. There's Menelaus, face to face with the city that sheltered his wife's abductor, probably fighting every instinct to challenge Paris to single combat right there in the throne room. Odysseus, ever the diplomat, presented their demands with a kind of persuasive eloquence that had made him famous throughout Greece. King Priam, Odysseus declared, his voice carrying the authority of the entire Greek coalition, "We come seeking justice, not war. Return Helen and the treasures stolen from Sparta. Make fair compensation for this breach of sacred hospitality, and we will depart in peace." Troy need not suffer for the actions of one man. But Paris, with the arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions, refused to even consider returning Helen. She came willingly, he declared, probably while Helen herself sat silent beside him, her thoughts hidden behind the perfect features that had launched this expedition. What kind of husband abandons the woman he loves because of Greek threats? Historians still argue whether Helen was present during these negotiations or kept away from the proceedings, but either way, the diplomatic mission ended in complete failure. The Greeks departed with nothing but Troy's defiance. While the Trojans prepared for a siege, they were confident their walls could withstand indefinitely. What followed was the kind of grinding, attritional warfare that destroys souls along with bodies. Day after day, the Greeks hurled themselves against Troy's defenses, while the defenders rained death down from their impregnable walls. Neither side could gain decisive advantage. The Greeks couldn't break through the fortifications, but the Trojans couldn't drive the invaders back into the sea. The plain between Troy's walls and the Greek camp became a killing field where heroes made their reputations and ordinary warriors found anonymous graves. You could watch the tide of battle flow back and forth across blood-soaked earth, bronze weapons clashing in the eternal rhythm of attack and counterattack that would define the next decade. Slowly, painfully, both sides began to understand that this wasn't going to be the quick campaign anyone had envisioned. The Greeks settled into their beach camp for what was clearly going to be a long siege, while Troy's civilians adapted to life under constant threat of assault. Children who'd been toddlers when the war began would grow up knowing nothing but the sound of bronze on bronze and the sight of funeral pyres burning on both sides of the battlefield. Winter brought a temporary lull in major fighting, but it also brought the grim realization that this conflict had developed its own momentum. Too much blood had been spilled, too much honor was at stake, and too many heroes had made oaths they couldn't abandon without losing everything that made life worth living. As snow began to fall on the plain of Troy, covering the scars of battle with deceptive purity, both armies huddled around their fires and contemplated a future that stretched endlessly ahead. The war that was supposed to last months was already measuring itself in seasons, and everyone involved was starting to understand that they'd stumbled into something much larger and more terrible than anyone had planned. The walls of Troy stood as strong as ever, their limestone blocks unmarked by Greek assault, but they were no longer just fortifications. They'd become symbols of a city's determination to survive and an army's refusal to admit defeat. The stage was set for a conflict that would consume an entire generation of heroes and change the ancient world forever. 9 years had crawled by like 9 centuries, and the children born when this war began were now old enough to hold swords and understand that the sound of clashing bronze was just another part of daily life. You're witnessing what happens when an epic conflict settles into grinding routine. Heroes become middle-aged, young warriors learn their trade in real combat, and everyone involved starts to forget what peace actually feels like. The plain between Troy's walls and the Greek camp had been churned into a permanent battlefield, soaked with so much blood that nothing would grow there except the bitter herbs that seemed to thrive on human suffering. Both armies had evolved from the eager forces that first clashed on these shores into something harder, more professional, and infinitely more deadly. This was the year that hope arrived for Troy, in the form of King Rhesus of Thrace, riding toward the city with his legendary white horses that seemed to glow like captured moonlight. Picture these magnificent beasts, not just horses, but divine animals whose very presence on Trojan soil carried mystical significance. According to ancient prophecy, if Rhesus's horses drank from the river Scamander and grazed on Trojan grass, the city would never fall to Greek assault. Rhesus himself was everything Troy needed, a powerful ally with fresh troops, unlimited enthusiasm, and most importantly, no emotional investment in 9 years of accumulated grudges and battlefield trauma. His arrival sent waves of excitement through Troy's war-weary population and corresponding ripples of anxiety through the Greek camp. But if there's one thing this war had taught everyone, it's that hope can be the most dangerous emotion of all. Odysseus and Diomedes, 2 of the craftiest warriors in the Greek coalition, weren't about to let divine prophecy hand victory to their enemies. These weren't honorable heroes challenging foes to single combat. They were special operations specialists who understood that sometimes the most important battles happen in darkness and silence. On the very night that Rhesus arrived, as Troy celebrated, and the Thracian king prepared to fulfill the prophecy that would make his city invincible, Odysseus and Diomedes slipped through the darkness like death incarnate. Picture them moving through the Trojan camp, two shadows among many, invisible to sentries who'd grown complacent after years of routine siege warfare. What followed was less a battle than a systematic execution. They found Rhesus's tent, identified the sleeping king by his magnificent armor, and dispatched him with the kind of professional efficiency that would make modern special forces operators nod with approval. The legendary white horses were led away into the night before they could drink from Scamander or fulfill the prophecy that might have saved Troy. Historians still argue whether this night raid was legitimate military tactics or just really sophisticated murder, but what's undeniable is its effectiveness. By dawn, Troy's great hope lay dead in his own tent. His divine horses were grazing in the Greek camp, and the prophecy that might have ended the war had been strangled in its cradle. The psychological impact was devastating for both sides. Troy had watched salvation arrive only to be snatched away by enemies who seemed capable of striking anywhere, anytime. The Greeks, meanwhile, had proven they could adapt their tactics to meet any threat. But they'd also demonstrated just how far they were willing to go to avoid admitting defeat. This was war without illusions, conflict stripped of the heroic ideals that had originally motivated both sides. Rhesus's death marked a turning point where honor gave way to necessity, where victory became more important than the methods used to achieve it. The white horses that should have guaranteed Troy's survival, instead, became symbols of how even divine favor could be overthrown by human cunning and determination. But the raid's success came with a price that went beyond military casualties. Both armies were now committed to a level of warfare that made negotiated settlement virtually impossible. Too many heroes had died, too much treasure had been spent, and too many oaths had been sworn for either side to back down without losing everything that made their sacrifice meaningful. As you watch the Greek camp settling back into its familiar routines after the night's work, there's a sense that something fundamental has changed. The war that began as a quest to recover stolen Helen had transformed into something much darker. A conflict where survival mattered more than honor, where victory justified any method, and where both sides had become prisoners of their own commitment to a cause that none of them could quite remember choosing. The plain of Troy continued its endless cycle of death and temporary resurrection. Heroes continued to build their reputations on the graves of other heroes, and somewhere in the distance, those white horses grazed peacefully in the Greek camp, while their dead master's prophecy joined the long list of dreams that war had killed before they could come true. Yet neither side could admit what was becoming increasingly obvious. This war had developed its own momentum that carried everyone involved far beyond their original intentions. The Greeks couldn't leave without victory because too much had been sacrificed to simply walk away. The Trojans couldn't surrender because their walls were all that stood between their families and a decade's worth of accumulated Greek fury. Winter was coming again. The 9th winter of a war that was supposed to last a single campaigning season. Both armies would huddle around their fires, tend their weapons, and prepare for another year of the grinding attrition that was slowly consuming the heroic age itself. The conflict that had begun with divine beauty contests and romantic adventures had become something far more fundamental, a test of which civilization could endure more suffering while still calling it victory. The white horses of Rhesus, now contentedly eating Greek hay, served as perfect symbols of how even the most sacred prophecies could be perverted by human ingenuity and desperation. In a war where gods and mortals seemed equally powerless to bring about resolution, perhaps the only prophecy that mattered was the one that promised this conflict would continue until everyone involved had lost something precious enough to make them question whether winning was worth the price. "I will take Briseis from you." Agamemnon's voice thundered across the Greek camp with the kind of royal fury that made even seasoned warriors take a step backward. "You're witnessing the moment when the greatest military expedition in human history began tearing itself apart from the inside, all because two kings couldn't agree on who deserved which prize of war. Picture the scene in the ninth summer of this endless siege. The Greek camp sweltering under a brutal sun while a plague sent by Apollo ravages the army like divine punishment. Men who'd survived 9 years of Trojan spears were dropping dead from fever and disease, their bodies piling up faster than funeral pyres could consume them. The stench of death hung over the camp like a visible cloud, and morale was cracking under the pressure of supernatural punishment. The cause of Apollo's wrath was grimly predictable. Agamemnon had claimed Chryseis, daughter of Chryses, who served as Apollo's priest, as his personal prize after a successful raid. When the old priest came to ransom his daughter with gold and tears, Agamemnon sent him away with insults and threats. Big mistake. You don't disrespect Apollo's clergy without consequences. And those consequences were now decimating the Greek army. Calchas the seer, looking even more haggard than usual after days of plague-induced nightmares, delivered the divine diagnosis with the kind of reluctance that comes from knowing your audience won't like what you have to say. The god demands the return of Chryseis, he announced to the assembled Greek leaders, his voice carrying across an unnaturally quiet camp. No gifts, no ransom, only her unconditional release will end this pestilence. Agamemnon's reaction was everything you'd expect from a king who'd spent 9 years getting used to absolute authority. He raged against the prophecy, questioned Calchas's competence, and generally behaved like someone whose divine right to rule was being challenged by inconvenient facts. But with his army literally dying around him, even the High King of Greece couldn't ignore Apollo's wrath indefinitely. "Fine," Agamemnon finally snarled, his face twisted with the kind of fury that comes from being forced to back down in public. "I'll return the girl to her father and end this plague. But I won't be the only Greek king who loses his prize. If I must give up Chryseis, then I'll take compensation from one of you." His eyes fell on Achilles like a hawk spotting prey, and suddenly the temperature in that plague-stricken camp seemed to drop 10 degrees. Here were the two most powerful figures in the Greek coalition. Agamemnon with his political authority and vast resources, Achilles with his divine mother and reputation as the greatest warrior of his generation, staring at each other across a gulf that was about to become unbridgeable. "I'll take Briseis," Agamemnon declared with the casual arrogance of someone who'd forgotten that some people can't be pushed around. "Your captive will replace mine, and balance will be restored." Now Briseis wasn't just any prisoner of war. She was the woman Achilles had claimed after the brutal sack of Lyrnessus, and over the months of captivity, something resembling genuine affection had developed between them. Whether you call it love, Stockholm Syndrome, or just mutual respect born from shared trauma, Achilles genuinely cared about her welfare and considered her his by right of conquest. Historians still argue whether Agamemnon's demand was motivated by genuine need for compensation or just petty jealousy of Achilles' growing influence. But what happened next was pure explosive fury that had been building for 9 years of shared command and competing egos. Achilles went from zero to homicidal rage in the space of a heartbeat. His hand flew to his sword hilt with the kind of reflexive speed that had made him legendary, and for one terrifying moment it looked like the Greek expedition was about to lose both its supreme commander and its greatest warrior in a single stroke of divine bronze. "You drunken fool," Achilles snarled, his voice shaking with barely controlled violence. "You sit in your tent counting treasure while better men die for your ambition, and now you want to steal what I've earned with my own blood? Touch Briseis, and I'll send you to Hades so fast your shadow won't have time to follow." Only divine intervention prevented the Greek coalition from imploding right there in the plague-stricken camp. Athena herself appeared to Achilles, invisible to everyone else but blazingly real to the furious warrior, and grabbed his sword arm with strength that even his supernatural reflexes couldn't overcome. "Think, you hot-headed fool," the goddess hissed in his ear with the kind of practical wisdom that saves kingdoms. "Kill Agamemnon now, and you'll destroy everything you fought for. Better to let him shame himself with this theft and wait for justice to find its own path." So instead of committing regicide, Achilles chose something almost worse: public humiliation of his commanding officer. Standing before the assembled Greek leadership, he delivered the kind of verbal assassination that destroys reputations more effectively than any sword. "Take her then, you coward," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the camp. "Take Briseis and prove to everyone that you lead from the rear, while better men bleed for your glory. But know this, I'm done fighting your war. My Myrmidons and I withdraw from this campaign. Let's see how your mighty coalition fares against Hector without Achilles at your side." And with that pronouncement, the greatest warrior in human history stormed back to his black ships, taking with him not just his own legendary fighting skills, but the elite Myrmidon warriors who formed the spearhead of every major Greek assault. Agamemnon got his prize, but at the cost of losing the one man who could actually win this war. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Troy's defenders, watching from their walls as Achilles' ships remained conspicuously inactive, began planning the kind of aggressive sorties they hadn't dared attempt in years. The Greek rank and file, already demoralized by plague and endless siege, now had to contemplate fighting without their greatest champion. But perhaps the most telling moment came when Briseis was led away from Achilles' camp to Agamemnon's tent. She went without resistance, but her eyes remained fixed on the warrior who'd claimed her as prize, but treated her with something approaching respect. In a war full of tragic figures, she represented something even sadder, a woman whose fate was decided by the egos of men who used her as a symbol for their own wounded pride. As night fell over the Greek camp, you could feel the balance of power shifting like tectonic plates finding new positions. Achilles sat brooding by his ships, his legendary armor hanging unused, while his mother Thetis rose from the sea to comfort her furious son. The war that had already consumed 9 years was about to enter its deadliest phase, all because two kings couldn't share their toys like civilized adults. "Let me wear your armor and lead the Myrmidons into battle," Patroclus pleaded, his voice breaking with desperate urgency as he watched Greek ships burning on the beach like massive funeral pyres. "You're witnessing the moment when love, the pure, selfless kind that exists between true friends, was about to collide head-first with the brutal realities of divine prophecy and heroic pride." The situation at the Greek camp had gone from bad to absolutely catastrophic. With Achilles and his elite Myrmidons sitting out the fighting, Hector had seized the initiative and was pressing attacks that brought Trojan forces right to the edge of the sea itself. The beach that had been a Greek stronghold for 9 years was now a killing field, where Troy's greatest warrior carved through enemy ranks like a force of nature unleashed. Picture Patroclus in this desperate hour, gentle by nature, beloved by everyone who knew him, but watching helplessly as his friends and comrades died because his best friend's wounded pride had removed the expedition's most effective fighting force from the war. He'd grown up with Achilles, shared every adventure and danger since childhood, and understood better than anyone the complex mix of honor, fury, and genuine hurt that kept the great warrior sulking in his tent. The flames from burning Greek ships cast dancing shadows across Achilles' face as he sat motionless in his camp, polishing weapons he refused to use, while men he'd fought beside for nearly a decade screamed and died just beyond his hearing. His divine armor hung on its stand like an accusation, every piece crafted by the gods themselves, but rendered useless by its owner's stubborn refusal to forgive Agamemnon's insult. "They're dying out there," Patroclus said quietly, his words carrying the weight of 9 years' shared brotherhood. "Ajax is wounded, Diomedes can barely stand, and Odysseus is fighting with 3 broken ribs. Hector's pushing them back to the ships, and if those burn, this entire expedition dies with them." Achilles' response was exactly what you'd expect from someone whose sense of honor had been publicly violated by the man supposedly leading their cause. "Let them burn," he snarled, though the pain in his voice suggested his heart wasn't quite as hard as his words. "Let Agamemnon watch his precious ships turn to ash, and remember the warrior he chose to insult. My honor is worth more than his ambition." But Patroclus had spent too many years reading his friend's moods to be fooled by surface anger. He could see the conflict tearing Achilles apart. the genuine fury at Agamemnon's theft, warring against love for comrades who were dying because of his absence. This was the opening he needed, the crack in Achilles' armor that love could exploit where duty and obligation had failed. "Then let me go," Patroclus said with the kind of quiet determination that can move mountains. "Lend me your armor. Let me lead the Myrmidons into battle, just long enough to drive Hector back from the ships. The Trojans will think you've returned to the fight. The sight of your armor might be enough to break their charge without anyone having to die." Historians still argue whether Patroclus was motivated by pure altruism, or if he was secretly hoping to win his own share of battlefield glory. But what's certain is that his proposal offered Achilles a way to save his friends without compromising his stand against Agamemnon. It was the kind of clever solution that should have worked perfectly, except that warfare has a way of making even the best plans spiral out of control. Achilles agreed, but with conditions that revealed just how well he understood the dangers involved. "Drive them back from the ships, then return immediately," he commanded, his hands trembling slightly as he helped Patroclus don the divine armor that had never known defeat. "Don't pursue them to Troy's walls. Don't try to take the city. Just save the fleet and come back alive." The transformation was immediate and unsettling. Patroclus had always been the gentler of the two friends, but wrapped in Achilles' bronze and bearing the legendary spear that only Achilles could normally wield, he became something different, a weapon of war that blazed with reflected divine power. Even the Myrmidons, elite warriors who'd followed Achilles through countless battles, looked at their substitute leader with something approaching awe. The charge that followed was exactly what the Greek cause needed, and exactly what would doom everything that mattered most to Achilles. Patroclus led the Myrmidons across the bloody plain like a bronze thunderbolt, his borrowed armor flashing in the afternoon sun, while the sight of what appeared to be Achilles returning to battle sent shock waves through both armies. Trojan warriors who'd been pressing their advantage suddenly found themselves facing what they thought was death incarnate. The Myrmidons, energized by months of enforced inactivity and led by someone wearing their beloved commander's armor, carved through enemy ranks with systematic precision that would have made their absent leader proud. For a glorious hour, the plan worked exactly as intended. Hector's assaults stalled, then reversed as Trojan forces pulled back from the terrible figure in divine armor who seemed to be everywhere at once. The burning ships were saved, the Greek line was restored, and Patroclus tasted the kind of battlefield glory that he'd always watched from the sidelines. But success in war can be more dangerous than failure, especially when divine prophecy is involved. Flushed with victory and caught up in the intoxicating rush of combat, Patroclus forgot Achilles' warnings and pressed his attack toward Troy's walls. This wasn't just tactical enthusiasm. It was fate itself drawing him toward an appointment that had been written in the stars since the day Achilles chose glory over a long life. 3 times Patroclus charged the gates of Troy, and 3 times Apollo himself pushed him back with divine force that should have been warning enough for any mortal. But the god of prophecy had his own role to play in this tragedy, and when Patroclus ignored the divine warnings and charged a 4th time, Apollo struck him down with supernatural force that left him stunned and defenseless. In that moment of divine-induced vulnerability, a Trojan warrior named Euphorbus managed to wound the fallen hero with a spear thrust that pierced the divine armor like it was made of paper. But it was Hector who delivered the killing blow, his bronze spear finding Patroclus's heart with the precision that had made him Troy's greatest champion. As life fled from his eyes, Patroclus managed one final prophecy that would prove terrifyingly accurate. "Enjoy your victory while you can, Hector," he whispered with his dying breath. "Death stands behind you waiting, and Achilles will not rest until you join me in the darkness." The news of Patroclus's death reached Achilles like a physical blow that shattered something fundamental in the greatest warrior's soul. His anguished cries echoed across the Greek camp with such raw pain that even hardened veterans stopped what they were doing to listen to grief that seemed to crack the very foundations of the earth. The sound that came from Achilles when he learned of Patroclus's death wasn't human. It was the roar of a wounded god, a cry of anguish so raw and terrible that it made the earth itself seem to tremble. You're witnessing the moment when the greatest warrior in human history transformed from sulking hero into something far more dangerous, an instrument of divine vengeance that would make the battlefield run red with Trojan blood. His grief was a thing to behold and fear. Achilles threw himself to the ground, tearing at his hair and covering his face with dust and ashes, while his cries carried across both camps with the force of a supernatural storm. This wasn't just mourning. It was the complete breakdown of someone whose entire world had been built around one irreplaceable friendship, now shattered by his own pride and stubbornness. Thetis rose from the wine-dark depths of the Aegean like silver moonlight given form, drawn by her son's anguish with the supernatural awareness that only divine mothers possess. When she found Achilles writhing in the sand of his camp, covered in dirt and tears, even the immortal sea nymph wept to see such devastation in someone she loved more than her own eternal existence. "My son," she whispered, her voice carrying the sound of waves on distant shores, "I felt your pain across all the waters of the world. Tell me what has broken your heart so completely that even the fish in the deepest trenches have stopped their songs to listen." "Patroclus is dead," Achilles sobbed, the words tearing from his throat like physical wounds. "My dearest friend, my other self, he wore my armor into battle and Hector killed him for my pride. I sent him to his death because I was too stubborn to swallow my anger at Agamemnon. I might as well have driven the spear through his heart myself." Thetis held her son with the desperate tenderness of someone who could see the future and knew exactly where this grief was leading. As a sea nymph married to a mortal, she'd always known that her child would face the choice between a long, obscure life and a short, glorious one that would make him immortal in human memory. Now that choice was making itself, and there was nothing she could do to change his destiny. "If you return to battle to avenge Patroclus," she said with the kind of prophetic certainty that makes even gods weep, "your own death will follow swiftly. This is the fate the fates have spun for you. Glory and death intertwined like threads in an inevitable tapestry." Achilles' response came without hesitation, spoken with the kind of absolute conviction that reshapes reality around itself. "Then let death come quickly. What worth is life when I've failed to protect the one person I loved most? I'll not eat or drink or know a moment's peace until Hector lies dead by my hand, and if that means joining Patroclus in the underworld, then so be it." But there was one problem. Hector now possessed Achilles' divine armor, stripped from Patroclus' body as the ultimate trophy of Trojan victory. So Thetis made the journey that every mother dreads, traveling to the divine forge of Hephaestus to beg for weapons that would enable her son's revenge and seal his doom. The lame god of fire and metalwork, moved by Thetis' tears and his own understanding of loss, worked through the night at his supernatural forge. You could hear the divine hammering echoing across Mount Olympus as Hephaestus crafted armor that would make even gods pause in wonder. A breastplate that blazed like the sun itself, greaves of indestructible bronze that would turn aside any mortal weapon, and most magnificent of all, a shield that depicted the entire cosmos in living metal. Historians still argue whether the armor Hephaestus created was purely symbolic or actually possessed supernatural protective properties. But what's certain is that when Thetis delivered it to her son at dawn, even the sunrise seemed dim by comparison. This wasn't just equipment, it was divinity made manifest in bronze and gold, armor worthy of the hero who would change the course of human destiny. The moment Achilles strapped on his new panoply, his transformation was complete. The grieving friend became death incarnate, his eyes burning with fury that made veteran warriors cross themselves and pray to whatever gods might protect them from what was coming. He called for an assembly of the entire Greek army, and even Agamemnon came running when he heard that terrible voice. Standing before the assembled host in armor that hurt to look at directly, Achilles formally renounced his quarrel with Agamemnon in words that carried across the camp like bronze thunder. "The anger that divided us has cost too much," he declared, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. While we squabbled like children over a woman, good men died, and my dearest friend paid the price for my wounded pride. I return to battle now, not for you, Agamemnon, not for Helen, not for Greece, but for Patroclus, who deserved better than to die wearing my armor while I sulked in my tent. Agamemnon, perhaps recognizing that this was not the time for royal dignity or face-saving politics, immediately offered to return Briseis along with all the treasure he'd originally promised. But Achilles waved aside the gifts with contempt that made even hardened negotiators wince. Material possessions meant nothing to someone whose heart had been carved out and replaced with pure vengeance. "Keep your treasures," he snarled, already turning toward the battlefield where destiny waited. "They mean nothing to me now. All that matters is getting my hands around Hector's throat before the sun sets." Even his immortal horses, Xanthos and Balios, offspring of the west wind who could speak with human voices when the gods allowed it, tried to warn him about the fate that awaited. "We will carry you swiftly today, mighty Achilles," said Xanthos with the kind of supernatural sadness that makes mortals weep. "But the hour of your death approaches. It is not through any failure of ours that Patroclus fell, but by the will of the gods and the strength of men." "I know I am doomed to die here far from my homeland," Achilles replied with the terrible serenity of someone who'd already made peace with his fate. "But I will not depart for the house of Hades before sending Hector ahead to announce my coming." When Achilles finally charged onto the battlefield in his blazing new armor, the effect was like watching a natural disaster with a personal vendetta. Trojan warriors who'd been confidently pressing their advantage suddenly found themselves facing something that seemed more divine than human. A figure whose very presence warped reality around itself like bronze lightning given murderous purpose. The slaughter that followed would echo through human memory for 3,000 years, a demonstration of what happens when divine favor, supernatural equipment, and absolutely justified fury combine in one unstoppable package of perfectly focused vengeance. The rage of Achilles transformed the battlefield into something beyond human comprehension. A killing field where bronze met flesh with the kind of systematic precision that made even gods pause to watch. You're witnessing what happens when grief becomes a weapon, when divine fury takes human form and decides that an entire city must pay for the death of one beloved friend. Trojan warriors who'd spent 9 years learning to fear Greek bronze suddenly found themselves facing something infinitely worse than ordinary warfare. Achilles moved through their ranks like death incarnate, his new divine armor blazing in the afternoon sun, while his spear never missed its target, and his sword opened throats with surgical precision. This wasn't battle. It was butchery, elevated to the level of high art. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Soldiers who'd stood firm against Greek charges for nearly a decade broke and ran at the mere sight of Achilles approaching. His reputation had already been legendary, but now it transcended into something approaching supernatural terror. Veterans who'd faced down Ajax and Diomedes without flinching took one look at the armored figure cutting through their ranks and decided that discretion was definitely the better part of valor. But it was the river Scamander itself that provided the most terrifying demonstration of just how far beyond normal human limits Achilles had gone. As he pursued fleeing Trojans into the water, slaughtering them so efficiently that their blood turned the sacred stream crimson, the river god himself rose up in protest against this unprecedented carnage. Picture the scene, the very waters of Troy rising up like a liquid mountain, roaring with divine fury, as the river god Scamander tried to drown the Greek hero who was polluting his sacred flow with so much Trojan blood. "Enough!" the river thundered with a voice like rushing rapids. "You have filled my streams with corpses, choked my channels with the dead. I cannot reach the sea for all the bodies you have thrown into my waters." Any normal mortal would have been swept away instantly by divine wrath made manifest in tons of crushing water. But Achilles fought the river itself with the kind of supernatural determination that made even immortals reconsider their assumptions about what mortals could accomplish. Only the intervention of Hephaestus, sending divine fire to drive back the waters, saved the greatest warrior from drowning in his own moment of triumph. That's when you knew this had gone beyond ordinary warfare into something cosmic. When gods were intervening directly to prevent other gods from interfering with mortal vengeance, you were watching destiny itself being written in bronze and blood. But all of this carnage was just the prelude to what everyone knew was coming: the inevitable confrontation between Achilles and Hector, Troy's greatest defender and the man who'd killed Patroclus. The entire war had been building toward this moment, this collision between the two greatest warriors of their generation, each representing everything their respective civilizations stood for. Hector knew exactly what was coming for him. Standing alone outside Troy's gates, while his people pleaded with him to come inside the walls, he understood that running would save his life, but destroy his honor. This was the burden of being a true hero. Sometimes you have to face certain death, because the alternative is living with shame that's worse than dying. "Come inside the walls," King Priam begged from the ramparts, his aged voice cracking with paternal desperation. "You've done enough, my son. No one will call you coward for refusing to face a man driven mad by grief and armed by the gods themselves." But Hector's response revealed exactly why he'd become Troy's greatest champion and most beloved prince. "I cannot hide behind walls while others die for my decisions," he declared with the kind of quiet courage that makes ordinary people believe in heroes. "I led our forces in their confidence. I cannot abandon them in their fear." Yet, when Achilles finally appeared on the horizon, like a bronze comet trailing divine fire, even Hector's legendary courage faltered. This wasn't cowardice. It was the rational response of someone whose survival instincts were screaming that he was about to face something beyond human opposition. The figure approaching him seemed less like a man than like a force of nature given murderous purpose. What followed was one of the most psychologically complex chase scenes in all of literature. 3 times Hector ran around Troy's walls with Achilles in pursuit, not because he was afraid to die, but because his body's survival instincts temporarily overwhelmed his mind's commitment to honor. You could see the internal struggle playing out in real time, duty warring against self-preservation, while an entire city watched from the walls. Historians still argue whether Hector's flight was genuine panic or a calculated attempt to exhaust his pursuer. But what ended the chase was typically divine intervention with a cruel twist. Athena appeared to Hector in the form of his brother Deiphobus, convincing him to make a stand by promising support that she had no intention of providing. "Brother," the disguised goddess called, her voice perfectly mimicking the Trojan prince. "Let's face this madman together. 2 of us can surely handle one grief-crazed Greek, no matter how divinely equipped." So Hector turned to face his doom, only to discover that his brother had vanished like morning mist, leaving him alone with Achilles and the terrible certainty that he'd been manipulated by divine powers that wanted this confrontation to end in only one way. The duel itself was brief, but absolutely devastating. Hector fought with the desperate skill of someone defending everything he loved, but Achilles fought with something beyond skill, with fury that had been refined into a weapon more deadly than any bronze could ever be. The outcome was never really in doubt. This was less a battle than an execution disguised as single combat. When Achilles' spear found the gap in Hector's throat, ironically, the one vulnerable spot in armor that had once belonged to Achilles himself, Troy's greatest hope fell with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire ancient world. The hero who'd held the Greeks at bay for 9 years, who'd embodied everything noble about defending one's homeland, died in the dust outside his own city gates. But Achilles' revenge was just beginning, and what he did next would shock even his own allies and earn the condemnation of gods and men alike. In a display of fury that went beyond anything civilized warfare allowed, he tied Hector's body to his chariot and dragged it around Troy's walls in full view of the defenders, including the dead hero's wife and infant son. For 11 days, Achilles continued this desecration, driving his chariot around Patroclus' tomb each morning with Hector's corpse in tow, as if the repeated humiliation could somehow bring back the friend whose death had broken something fundamental in the greatest warrior's soul. King Priam knelt down and kissed the hands that had killed his son, his aged voice breaking as he whispered the words that would crack even the hardest heart. Remember your own father, Achilles. You're witnessing one of the most powerful moments in all of human storytelling. When shared grief becomes a bridge between enemies, when the love of fathers for their sons transcends all the hatred that war creates. For 11 days, Achilles had desecrated Hector's body in a display of rage that shocked both armies and offended the gods themselves. Even Zeus, who'd stayed relatively neutral throughout this conflict, finally reached his divine breaking point. The king of the gods sent Thetis to her son with a message that carried the weight of cosmic authority. You have angered the immortals with your excessive vengeance. The time has come to accept ransom and return Hector's body to his people. But the most remarkable intervention came from Hermes, the divine messenger, who guided old King Priam through the Greek camp in the darkness of the 12th night. Picture this scene: an elderly king, his white hair streaming in the night wind, making his way secretly through enemy territory with nothing but divine protection and a father's desperate love to shield him from the warriors who'd been trying to kill him for nearly a decade. The treasure that Priam brought would have ransomed a dozen heroes. Gold and silver, precious fabrics, bronze tripods, and jewelry that sparkled like captured starlight. But the real currency he carried was something far more valuable and dangerous: the raw, unfiltered grief of a father who'd watched too many of his sons die and couldn't bear to leave his greatest child unburied. When Priam entered Achilles' tent, the contrast was almost unbearable to witness. Here was the enemy king, defenseless and aged, facing the warrior who'd single-handedly devastated his army and killed his beloved son. Yet instead of rage or fear, what passed between them was something much more profound: the recognition that grief makes all men brothers, regardless of which side they fight for. Historians still argue whether Priam's appeal was carefully calculated rhetoric or genuine emotional breakdown, but what's certain is that his words hit Achilles like a bronze spear straight to the heart. Think of your own father Peleus, the old king pleaded, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. He too is old and gray, waiting for a son who may never return home. At least he can hope, while I kneel before the killer of my children. That's when something fundamental shifted in Achilles' soul. For the first time since Patroclus' death, he saw beyond his own anguish to recognize the pain he'd caused others. This wasn't just about Hector anymore. It was about fathers and sons, about the terrible price that war extracts from everyone it touches, about the way grief connects us across all the artificial boundaries that normally divide human beings. The two men wept together in that tent, not as Greek and Trojan, not as hero and enemy king, but as fathers and sons who'd lost too much to this endless conflict. Achilles cried for Patroclus, for his own approaching death that he could feel waiting in the shadows, and for the father he'd never see again. Priam mourned not just Hector, but all his sons who'd fallen to Greek spears, all the grandchildren he'd never meet, all the future that war had stolen from his family. When dawn finally came, Achilles had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. He agreed not only to return Hector's body, but to grant the Trojans 12 days of truce for funeral rites. This wasn't just military courtesy, it was recognition that some things transcend warfare, that honoring the dead matters more than continuing to kill the living. The preparation of Hector's body was handled with a reverence that bordered on religious ceremony. Achilles personally supervised the washing and anointing, ensuring that Troy's greatest hero was returned to his family with the dignity befitting his station and courage. The armor was cleaned, the wounds were tended, and the corpse was wrapped in the finest cloth that Greek treasure could provide. But perhaps the most poignant moment came when Achilles helped load Hector's body onto Priam's wagon, handling the dead prince with the same care he'd once shown to Patroclus. These weren't the actions of a mindless killer, but of someone who understood that true honor requires recognizing the humanity of your enemies, even in death. The 12-day truce that followed felt like waking up from a nightmare that had lasted nearly a decade. For the first time in years, soldiers from both armies could walk the plain between Troy and the Greek camp without fear of sudden death. Children from the city came to see the legendary Greek heroes up close, while homesick warriors gazed up at Troy's walls and remembered what civilization looked like when it wasn't under siege. Hector's funeral was everything a hero's send-off should be. The greatest warrior Troy had ever produced was burned on a pyre built from the finest woods the city could provide, while his family, his people, and even some of his former enemies paid their respects to a man whose courage had earned universal admiration. Even in death, Hector represented the best of what humanity could achieve when honor mattered more than survival. But as the funeral flames died down and the temporary peace drew to its close, everyone involved understood that this interlude was just that. A brief pause in a conflict that had developed its own unstoppable momentum. Too much blood had been spilled, too many oaths had been sworn, and too many heroes had died for either side to simply walk away from what they'd started. Achilles himself seemed to find a kind of peace in this act of mercy, but it was the peace of someone who'd made his final accounting with honor and was ready for whatever fate awaited him. He'd avenged Patroclus, he'd shown compassion to his enemy, and he'd proven that even in the midst of the bloodiest war in human history, there was still room for the kind of noble gesture that made life worth living. As the truce period ended and both armies prepared to resume their deadly dance, you could feel destiny gathering itself for the final acts of this epic tragedy. The greatest heroes on both sides had played their parts, made their choices, and sealed their fates. All that remained was to see which civilization would still be standing when the last sword was sheathed and the final funeral pyre had burned to ash. The war would continue. Heroes would fall, and cities would burn. But the moment when an enemy king kissed the hands of his son's killer and found compassion instead of revenge would echo through human memory as proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, there's still room for the kind of grace that makes us worthy of the stories we tell about ourselves. The arrow of Paris found the one spot on Achilles' body where bronze and divine protection couldn't save him, that cursed heel, where his mother's grip had prevented the waters of immortality from reaching. You're witnessing the moment when the greatest warrior in human history discovered that even heroes have breaking points, even legends have fatal flaws, and even the gods can't protect you from the destiny that's been written in your stars since birth. The 10th year of this endless war had brought desperate allies to Troy's aid, each one representing a final hope that somehow divine favor or supernatural intervention might tip the balance. First came Penthesilea, the Amazon queen, whose warrior women fought with a skill and ferocity that made even veteran Greek soldiers question their assumptions about gender and warfare. Achilles had killed her in single combat, but not before she'd proven that courage and deadly skill weren't exclusively male virtues. Then Memnon arrived from distant Ethiopia, son of the dawn goddess Eos, leading an army of African warriors whose bronze armor gleamed like captured sunlight. His duel with Achilles had been the stuff of legend, two heroes of nearly equal skill and divine parentage battling, while the gods themselves watched from Mount Olympus. Zeus had even weighed their fates on golden scales before decreeing that Memnon must fall. But the Ethiopian king's death had cost Achilles something precious, the last of his joy in warfare. By the time Paris finally worked up the courage to face Achilles directly, the Greek hero was already showing signs of the weariness that comes from too much killing, too much loss, too much time spent being death incarnate instead of simply human. The young man who'd once delighted in his own supernatural skill had become something harder and sadder, a weapon that was beginning to understand the true cost of being wielded by fate. Historians still argue whether Paris's fatal shot was pure luck, divine intervention, or just the inevitable result of a prophecy that demanded fulfillment. But what's certain is that when Apollo guided that arrow to its target, an entire age of heroes died with Achilles. The warrior who'd been thought invincible fell outside Troy's Scaean gate, probably more surprised than anyone that his legendary career was ending at the hands of the very prince whose romantic adventures had started this whole catastrophic war. The battle that erupted over Achilles' body was everything you'd expect when the greatest prize in military history suddenly became available. Ajax and Odysseus fought like men possessed, holding off wave after wave of Trojan warriors who wanted to claim the ultimate trophy, the corpse of the hero who'd single-handedly kept their city under siege for a decade. The fighting was so fierce that the gods themselves had to intervene to prevent Achilles' body from being lost to the very enemies he'd spent years slaughtering. For 17 days, the Greek army mourned their fallen champion with the kind of elaborate funeral games that made ordinary royal ceremonies look like village festivals. Heroes competed in wrestling, chariot racing, and armed combat, while bards composed songs that would ensure Achilles' deeds lived on in human memory long after his body had turned to dust. Even his enemies acknowledged that something irreplaceable had been lost when that bronze-tipped arrow found its mark. But Achilles' death created a crisis that went beyond mere grief. Who would inherit the divine armor that had made him nearly invincible? The two leading candidates were Ajax the Greater, whose physical strength was second only to Achilles himself, and Odysseus, whose tactical brilliance had saved the Greek expedition more times than anyone could count. When the armor was awarded to Odysseus in recognition of his strategic genius rather than Ajax's raw fighting ability, the decision broke something fundamental in the greater Ajax's proud heart. Here was a warrior who'd stood firm when everyone else fled, who'd never retreated from any battlefield, who'd saved countless Greek lives through sheer, stubborn courage, and he was being told that cleverness mattered more than strength, that brains trumped bronze in the final accounting. Ajax's suicide was almost as devastating to Greek morale as Achilles' death had been. The man who'd been their rock, their unbreakable defensive specialist, fell on his own sword rather than live with what he saw as public humiliation. In the space of a few weeks, the Greek expedition had lost not just their greatest offensive weapon, but also their most reliable defender. The strategic situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Paris himself had died from a festering wound inflicted by Philoctetes. Remember him, the archer they'd abandoned on Lemnos years earlier? Brought back to the war when prophecy revealed that Troy couldn't fall without Heracles' divine bow. The irony was almost too perfect. The prince whose theft of Helen had started this war was killed by a man the Greeks had callously discarded when his suffering became inconvenient. But even with Paris dead and Achilles gone, Troy's walls still stood as impregnable as ever. The city that had withstood 10 years of siege showed no signs of weakening, while the Greek army was bleeding heroes faster than it could replace them. Something had to change, or this war would continue until both civilizations collapsed from sheer exhaustion. That's when Odysseus conceived the plan that would either end the war or destroy what remained of Greek honor. A stratagem so audacious that it seemed like madness, so clever that it just might work. "We cannot break those walls with strength," he told the assembled Greek leaders, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent a decade learning that intelligence could triumph where force failed. "But what if we could convince Troy to open its gates and invite us inside?" The wooden horse that rose from Odysseus's imagination was more than just military engineering. It was psychological warfare, elevated to the level of art. Picture this massive construction taking shape on the beaches where Greek ships had been drawn up for a decade, crafted by Epeius the master builder, but designed by a mind that understood human nature better than anyone since the gods themselves. Into the hollow belly of this wooden colossus went 30 of Greece's finest warriors. Not just fighters, but men who could remain silent and motionless for hours while their muscles cramped and their lungs burned for air. Odysseus himself led this desperate band, along with Menelaus, who'd waited 10 years to reclaim his stolen wife, and Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, who'd inherited his father's fighting skills along with his hunger for glory. As the main Greek fleet pretended to sail away in apparent defeat, leaving behind only the mysterious wooden offering and a single, abandoned soldier named Sinon, who'd volunteered for the most dangerous acting job in military history, the greatest deception in warfare was about to reach its climax. Troy stood on the verge of victory or annihilation, and no one, Not the defenders behind those mighty walls, not the warriors hidden in the horse's belly, not even the gods watching from Olympus could predict which way fate would tip the scales. The war that had begun with a golden apple and a beauty contest was about to end with wooden deception and the kind of clever brutality that would echo through human memory as both triumph and tragedy, proving once and for all that in warfare, as in life, the cleverest plan often matters more than the strongest sword. The wooden horse stands silent on the empty plain, its painted eyes staring toward Troy's gates with the patience of destiny itself. Inside, 30 warriors breathe as quietly as death, while outside, the city that has endured 10 years of siege prepares for what its people believe will be the first peaceful night in a decade. The wind carries different sounds now, not the clash of bronze or the cries of battle, but the gentle whisper of waves against an empty shore and the distant sound of celebration from behind walls that have never been breached. Soon, very soon, those walls will echo with screams instead of songs, and the city that thought itself saved will learn the final terrible lesson about the price of war. Troy sleeps, dreaming of victory, while wooden death waits patiently for darkness to fall and destiny to complete the circle that began with a golden apple at a wedding feast so long ago. The greatest war in human history draws toward its end, and in the morning, the world will be forever changed. Rest now. Let these ancient voices fade into the silence of memory and drift peacefully into dreams where heroes still walk the earth and stories never end.